So without further ado, I'll give you Rick Stieff.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, Hollis. Good evening. My name is Rick Stieff. I'm the CEO at Radon, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk with you this evening about radon testing. As Hollis mentioned, Radon is best known for our passive E-perm radon detectors, which we actually developed and patented about 30 years ago, and they're still one of the best passive radon detectors available. About 5 years ago, we also got into the continuous radon monitor business, and I think we have a very good sensitive CRM that's programmable, measures temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, tilts, and is quite inexpensive for a CRM. Hollis has asked me to teach you all you need to know about radon testing in less than 15 minutes with a short period for questions at the conclusion. So let's get started. Radon 101 in less than 10 minutes. We're going to blast right through these slides and really in short order, because I think most of you, this is old hat, and maybe the time would be more interesting and better spent at the conclusion with some questions. And so right off the bat, what is radon? Radon is an inert radioactive gas, odorless, tasteless, invisible. It's actually pulled into the homes from the soil surrounding the foundations by the slight negative pressure in the house. Next slide. Hollis, slide. Oh, good. Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I was looking at the wrong thing here. So after what is radon, the next slide should be why is it a concern? Okay, we're on. Ironically, radon is not the health risk. Radon decays into radioactive particles known as radon decay products. These are static atoms or that attach themselves to dust particles. You inhale the dust particles, they plate out in your lungs, and these radon decay products emit alpha emissions, just like radon, and they have 2 of these alpha emissions in about 45 minutes. And this is actually where the health risk comes from, not the radon gas. Next slide. Why are we concerned about it? It causes lung cancer, period. Next slide. So this slide kind of shows that radon, whether you're exposed to, say, 1 picocurie for 100 days or 100 picocuries for 1 day, the risk is about the same. Next slide. Radon is known as a group A carcinogen. It's known to cause, which means it's known to cause lung cancer in humans. Next slide. So this just kind of quantifies it. It's a pretty serious health risk. About 22,000 people a year, according to the EPA, die from radon-induced lung cancer more than drunk driving. Next slide. The EPA has set an action level of 4 picocuries per liter. Just for your knowledge, the average radon for indoor radon is 1.3 picocuries. Average outdoor radon is about 0.4 of a picocurie. Next slide. So the takeaway from this slide is really that you don't use maps to try to determine where to test for radon. This map, in fact, was developed as to where radon-resistant mitigation techniques should be used in new homes. Next slide. This is kind of showing in our area, Maryland and Virginia, that the tidal areas, you're less likely to find radon. In the Piedmont and mountainous areas, you're more likely to find radon. But again, you should be testing for radon Don't go by any maps or zone maps. Next slide. So radon is really pulled into it, sucked into the house from the soil. And it's the slight negative pressures in the house are primarily due to either exhaust fans or from the thermal stack effect. Hot air rises, which slightly depressurizes the lower portions of the house. Next slide. This is really just showing you that about 95% of all of the radon comes from the soil under and surrounding the home or the house, not very much from radon and water or emanating from building materials. Next slide. Again, just kind of a rule of thumb here. We always test in the lowest livable area. And the rule of thumb would be that the first floor is going to be about half of what the basement or the foundation would test at. Next slide. Okay, there, in my mind, there are about 3 golden rules for radon testing. And this is what you have to kind of keep in mind. Regardless of what kind of equipment you use, you must use a listed device. Those are the ones you can buy in the stores or get from any of the manufacturers, but they need to be listed by the NRSB or the NRPP, the 2 certifying organizations. The second golden rule is you have to follow the protocols for testing. We'll go into this a little bit later. And lastly, you want to maintain and retain records and documentation. So these are the 3 rules for radon testing. Next slide. This slide is showing some of the passive radon, radon detectors out there. So they're both basically for short-term radon testing. All of your radon testing is going to be real estate driven for the most part. And so EPERMs or activated charcoal are what you would be using. Next slide. So we're now getting into some of these protocols that are really important to follow when you're doing your radon testing. Number 1, all the exterior doors and windows have to be kept shut for the duration of the test and for 12 hours prior to the test for a valid radon test. You cannot have any devices which exchange outdoor air for indoor air. And if there is a radon mitigation system in place, it should be functioning on and functioning. Next slide. Again, for radon testing, you just want to be in the lowest suitable area for occupancy, even if it is unfinished. You do not want to test in areas that have fans like kitchens, bathrooms. You don't want to test in laundry rooms. Obviously, the garage would be out. You don't test in the attic areas and closets, this type of thing. Next slide. Okay, again, the part of the protocols, where do you place it within the room? 20 inches off the floor, 1 foot away from external walls, 3 feet away from windows or external doors. Next slide. Skip this slide. This is for non-real estate. All of your testing will be real estate driven. Next slide. Next. The passive devices, if you're using passive devices, there are a couple of rules for those. You always are going to be deploying duplicate detectors. They need to be 4 inches apart or in compliance with the manufacturer's instructions, and you average the result. So you get one average for the entire test duration of the test. If the average is greater than 4 or greater, then they recommend mitigation. So this would differ from the continuous radon monitor, which gives you the hourly devices. Next slide. Okay, here we're looking at a continuous radon monitor. That's a picture, an old slide in one of our competitors, but Radolec has a continuous radon monitor. Continuous radon monitors typically operate on either on batteries or AC. They usually can be programmed to delay the start. So if you got to that house and it was open, you could delay the start for 12 hours. They measure radon gas along with temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, tilts. Usually they'll have some kind of mechanism so you can mount it on the floor or something, a tripod case. So that really is the radon testing in a nutshell. I'll go over very briefly our equipment. Hollis didn't want this to be a promotional presentation. So I would say the takeaway from this whole test should be, you should seriously consider radon testing, especially if you're in those areas that are outside of the tidal areas. It's a very lucrative ancillary business, and I would encourage you to talk with your colleagues, see what devices they're using, and if they're using ours, or if you'd like to talk with me at a little greater length as to how the system might work for you, that's what we would be here for. So I will now take I think we got that in about 10 minutes. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer those, or if I've missed anything, you can kind of remind me what I may have missed.
All right, so if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. But meanwhile, what Radolec has graciously agreed to do is to give away a Ferret Wi-Fi camera. So if everybody, Rick, if you could get in mind a number between 1 and 100.
I've got that. I'm looking really quickly at my notes, Hollis, and one last thing I failed to mention is that if you're testing in Virginia, you need to be listed with the National Radon Safety Board or the National Radon Proficiency Programs. You have to be quote unquote licensed. In Maryland, not so much. But if you're in Virginia, you do need to be listed to provide radon testing.
Yeah, and
yeah, I've got my number.
Yeah, if you're not trained and certified in Maryland, I think that's foolish. Everybody should go out and get that training so that you actually.
I couldn't agree more. But it is absolutely required in Virginia.